Hey folks, and welcome back to Dungeons and Drybrushing. Now today I was scheduled to do a really big project, or to at least start one, but to be honest with you, I just wasn't feeling it this morning. I woke up wanting to craft, something a little different, something smaller, more personal. In other words, today we're going to be messing with scatter terrain. I'm going to take some bits and pieces that I have laying around and a few ideas I've got in my head and just have an experiment with it, see how it goes, and see if we can put together some scatter terrain that will fit in the city setting that I've been crafting for my next campaign. Alright, let's get started. I decided to start with making some clotheslines for hanging out the washing. That may seem a little odd to some of you since there's absolutely no chance that the party is ever going to interact with them. But for me, that's kind of actually the point, and it's a lot of what this video is about. I think that scatter terrain is actually an important storytelling tool for a crafting DM. Some of the most important items you can make for scatter don't have any mechanical applications in the game. They're not really good for cover, and they're pretty unlikely to ever be used by even the most chaotic and creative of players. And that's the point. What those items do instead is express how the people of your setting live, what their day-to-day life is like. What do they do for jobs? Do they live well? Is there abundant food and prosperity, or is there a broadly poor and starving populace? And of course, if your players get into a fight in the middle of a city street and the only things actually on the street are items they're clearly meant to interact with, that sort of gives up the artifice of the game. It harms the illusion that you're trying so hard to create. It can also contribute to the problem some players have of assuming there are no consequences for their actions. If you've reinforced the idea that things in your setting only exist for the convenience of the players, then why should they hesitate to act that way? After seeing how well the clotheslines were coming, I decided I also wanted one that I could string up between buildings, like window to window, but I didn't want it to be permanent, so it had to be something I could put up or take down at will. I decided that the way to go about doing that was with some longer barbecue skewers that I could sort of chop off and use as anchoring points, and then I just twisted the twine with some glue to stiffen it up and make it a bit tougher. While I waited for all of that glue to dry though, I just moved on to the next little bit of scatter, which is painting up a bunch of 3D printed amphorae. These were clay jugs, basically, that could contain anything from wine to grain or oil, or basically anything that needed to be transported, stored, or sold. Since these could be pretty much any color, I also took this as an opportunity to get out a bunch of paints that I really like but don't get to use enough, just to have a bit of fun with it. These are mostly going to be covered up anyway by the time I'm done with them, so I just roughly get the paint on there. No need for perfection. Once the amphorae are painted, it's time to construct some storage for them. Sort of shelving, I guess. This is just made of matchsticks and tacky glue, and it would be at home in a merchant shop, or as storage in a wealthy citizen's villa, or honestly even an abandoned camp. And if despite my clearly very persuasive arguments you're still not on board with the idea of scatter terrain that isn't for players to interact with, you can actually turn this into a mission objective. Maybe they have to poison a particular amphora of wine that they know is going to be purchased by a corrupt noble. Or maybe it's the opposite, and they have to figure out which one someone else poisoned before it's consumed. This is part of the fun of scatter terrain for me. Once I have it and I can see it in front of me, it's really easy to incorporate it into the story, even if it's something that, on its own, I would never think to base a story around. Okay, so I did decide that I want these amphora shelves to be modular too. I want them to be able to stand on their own or be stacked on top of each other, so I'm adding some posts to them so that they can be stacked easily. On a whim, I'm trying a totally new technique here, something I've never done before. That's also part of the fun of Scattercraft, is just trying things out. Now if you're like me and you buy big cheap packs of synthetic brushes to use for crafting, you've probably got a couple of these giant house painting brushes hanging around. I hate to waste things, and since I can't use them for painting, I'm going to try to use them for crafting. I want some straw bedding on these shelves, and the giant pale bristles of this brush look like a good contender to me. So I cut them off in bunches. I'm not too worried about the length of them since it's going to get trimmed up later on. Then I just brush regular PVA glue over the bed of the shelf and kind of scatter the straw randomly over top. I know that the PVA glue is going to dry clear, so it will hold the straw in place without being visible, but it's also going to reinforce the entire craft and make it sturdier. But that does bring us back to waiting for glue to dry, so... Okay, back to the clotheslines. The clotheslines just get a simple contrast paint job, skeleton horde, as usual on pieces made of real wood, and I did try using some Agrax Earth Shade over the butcher's twine, but not only did it make it darker than I wanted, it reactivated the glue, which I definitely should have seen coming. Ah well, lesson learned. Maybe. Probably not. Then it's time to trim up the straw on the amphora shelves. This actually turned out pretty well, I thought. It's definitely something I'll be using again, especially since I have a few of those brushes hanging around and nothing better to do with them. Once the excess is trimmed off, I thought it made pretty convincing straw. Then I just glue down the amphora themselves. I'm using tacky glue, but honestly regular PVA or even hot glue would be fine, whatever you have on hand. I just prefer tacky glue because it gives the strongest bond and it's easiest to work with. Once the glue is dry, I gave the amphora a wash with Army Painter's Soft Tone, and then they're done. A nice bit of modular, stackable scatter terrain. With the shelving done and the glue dry, I moved back to working on my clotheslines, starting with cutting the skewers for the anchor points on the longer line. Before going any further, I decided I should try hanging it up at least to see if the concept even works before spending more time on it. And thankfully, it does, which means I can move on to actually decorating the clotheslines now. For that, it's just a bit of paper towel. Shop towel, that is, the kind without any texture, would be better, but this is what I've got on hand. So I just cut out small pieces, brush them in a mix of PVA glue and water, and hang it over the clothesline. When the glue dries, it will stiffen the paper towel, and this just gets repeated for all 3 clotheslines. That brings us back to what seems like the biggest part of this project, waiting for glue to dry. So while that's happening, I'm just painting up some more scatter. A few tables and a giant clay barrel get added to the collection. Individually, these are small pieces that you could argue, on their own, add nothing to a setting. But when you get enough of them, it really does bring things to life and add character, culture, even story to your maps. In fact, you can even use scatter as a way to remind your players of missed objectives or urgent story beats, even the consequences of their own actions. For example, if you were playing during a particularly nasty plague and the players aren't doing what they could to take care of it, or have made bad decisions, maybe they start seeing corpse carts in the street, or even piles of burning bodies, since that's now the only safe way to dispose of the dead. It will not only bring the consequences of their actions home to them, but there's now a physical reminder on the table that they have the power to impact the setting. While I was crafting though, a couple more ideas came to me. I wanted to make a garden trellis. This is just something I was trying off the top of my head and I had no idea if it would work. But I start with some cross-stitch mesh and cut it at an angle so that the mesh pattern is diagonal. I make it roughly 3 inches tall, which is the usual height of one story on one of my crafted buildings. That way if I want to lean it against a building, it should be easy to do. Once it's cut, it gets a prime with a brown rattle can. Cross-stitch meshing can be very difficult to work with if it's not primed well. And then, out comes the tacky glue and the, well, plant bits. There's no art to how I'm doing this, and maybe there should have been, but I just take some vine-like plants and some colorful moss, glue them onto the mesh, and weigh it down so that it dries in one piece. Once it's dry, I decide to add a little more color by taking some pieces of old flower tufts and gluing them to the vines to make it a flowering vine. But I don't stop there, of course. I want to make a shaded overhang too, something you might find providing shade and beauty in a busy public place in a Greek or Roman city. So I 3D printed and painted some columns. I just use a few soft colors and stipple and wet blend them together. I used a brown, a yellow, an orange, and a pink. Then I hit it with a dry brush of drake tooth, paint in some of the details on the columns, and give the whole thing a light oil wash. After that, it gets the same treatment that the trellis did. Some cross-stitch mesh with a brown prime and a lot of plant matter and glue. In the end, I'm alright with how these bits came out, even if they look a bit like disheveled chia pets. I just did these off the top of my head, really, without any planning, and for that, I think they turned out pretty good. But I could definitely see a more advanced, better-looking version of this project somewhere in my future. And remember, experimentation is part of the process. It's totally okay to make things that are just alright, especially if it's part of your journey on the way to making things that are great. And if you put something down on your table that looks like a drunk chia pet and your players have a giggle, just remember, you're the DM. You have to be an adult about things, so do the adult thing and fill the next dungeon with rust monsters. Not so funny now, is it, Kevin? And while that dries, it's finally time for the finishing touches on the clothesline. It's nothing too crazy, just some contrast paints and some washes over top of the fabric to give it some color. And then, finally, it's time to show off the finished products and how they make a difference in setting up your table. Before we break everything down and see all this scattered terrain in action on the table, I just want to take this chance to say thank you to everyone for watching. If you haven't hit like and subscribe, please do that. It helps the channel a lot. And if you already have, I really appreciate it. If you want to help the channel in any other ways, there are links down below for how you can do that. Otherwise, let's just get into that breakdown. This is a city street typical of the city I'm creating. It looks fine, I guess. But when you start to add scatter terrain, that's when things come to life. It's what changes a bunch of empty-looking buildings into a lived-in space, a city that real people with real problems inhabit. And of course, as your collection of scatter builds up, and you're able to put more and more of it on the table, you can make your maps feel more alive. It's not only more fun to play on a map that looks lived in and properly evokes the setting that you're going for, but it also helps to add weight and consequence to the decisions that characters make at your table. And once you start adding in models for NPCs as well, all of that just gets amplified over again. So while putting down a dozen pieces of tiny scatter terrain may not have the same wow factor of crafting one huge project instead, it does do something pretty important. It helps to actually tell your story. It's one more way to reinforce what you already do as a DM, and to let your different hobbies and skill sets play together nicely and complement each other. Alright, that's it for this time, folks. Now the next video may take a little bit longer to get out because it is a huge project. I'm hoping it goes quickly, but you never know with stuff like this, and I've got a feeling it's going to turn out to be more complicated than I think it is. But we'll see. Hopefully it will be soon, and hopefully I'll see you on the next one.